Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining. I hope this session doesn't turn out to be a cluster, but it's all about clusters. So big thank you to Mark for joining today. How are you today, Mark?
My pleasure, Jim. And it's great to be here talking about this subject
Okay,
with
as
everything that's
usual.
going on. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As usual, let's talk about cluster data and why it's so important. And without wasting any time, let's jump straight in. Okay, so let's talk about the cluster data problem. So first of all, companies that build segments and paint with a broad brush lose engagement due to poor messaging. It could be people saying, hey, I'm going to target households with more than $100,000 in income, married, 2 kids, 2 cars, etc. That simply doesn't cut it anymore in today's world. Second big thing, to succeed, to personalize at scale, it's critical to create nano campaigns along unique lines of engagement. This means two things. One, very, very targeted campaigns down to very, very finite clusters or segments, and identify things that happen over time. Engage with customers when change in circumstance. For example, new baby, new job, moving to a new city, new car, whatever the case may be. Or for the enterprise, it could be 10,000 different types of scenarios. And the third point is correlations between clusters vary over time. The importance of being on top of that time vector and how things, circumstances change is very important. Mark, please shed some light on these three areas and how you approach them with clients today.
There's certainly a lot to unpack there, and in more than in the time that we have available today. But I think really it's important to start with defining what a cluster is. And just very quickly, you can think of it as a grouping, a grouping of behaviors or attributes within an audience at a particular moment in time, right? So a lot of it has to do with correlations. And often when you are looking at marketing campaigns and the way organizations are engaging with their audiences, they think very linearly, right? And not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just the way the mind works. Step one, step two, step three, step four, etc. The problem with that is that it creates a deterministic outcome, right? It means that, oh, if this person does this and then they do this and then they do that, that's the type of customer we want or the type of engagement we want. And the reality is in the world is that we're engaging through a lot of different, channels, which are adding other variables and other, attributes to what we're, to the person we're engaging with, and they may shift, right? And so you may actually want to send them something different, or they may want to engage differently as you learn more about them and they learn more about you. Now, the problem is that when you're in an organization that has, say several core campaigns or dozens or hundreds or thousands, as the case may be, they become very tuned and individuals become locked on them. And no matter how they engage with you, they can't move into something else that may be more appropriate for them. And so the real challenge there is to continuously learn about your audience. And I really like the term you have here in terms of nano campaigns, is to respond to an individual in your audience based on the attributes that they're displaying at that particular moment in time, not as how they started. Because you're learning as they're going along. And that generally what happens is new correlations form, and they become more important or less important depending on what your priorities are as you're going through that. And so the challenge with that is really staying on top of that and being dynamic in terms of how you work with that audience and how you engage with it, so that you're responding in a meaningful way to them and not locking people into a particular way of engagement. Now, some of that may be different, if you're dealing with, say, a B2C product that's, low price, high volume or something like that versus a highly complex B2B, or B2G type of sale. So there is some nuance to what I was just saying as well.
I am very happy you said that, because one of the things that I've always thought about is kind of a continuous distribution vector. If you could envision a time series of events that are happening to audiences or customers,
Mm-hmm.
and how you could, identify clusters within your audience to continuously modify who those audiences are and what they want based on time series data as they surface in real time, and how this would ultimately impact how you engage your audience. Could you spend a minute talking about that?
Yes, it's the first thing I would say is it's not pure time series. That's definitely one, axis, but there are multiple other accesses, right? It could be events. it could be geo, it could be, life stage or something like that, like, which I guess is another view of time. But the point is that the correlations, just as the correlations are changing to identify who your audience is and who should be clustered together, so is the value of each one of those over a period of time, right? And so you have to continuously be feeding in and searching for those new correlations, or those correlations that may exist inside of that cluster, so that you can respond differently than you had before, perhaps.
So this takes us to the process for data clusters. I'd like you to walk us through your process for managing them, but also touch on NLP, ML, AI, and how those elements are sprinkled into this process as well.
Sure. I'll just begin with an analogy. And this actually was from a conversation that I had with a CMO at a large organization just in the last couple of weeks. And he has said essentially what we're enabling, or how we're working with them, is to provide an answer to how they deliver depth at scale, right? How they go really deep, but also do it really big. And part of that is by, and when you think about AI and NLP and the other machine learning technologies, that are applied here, you have to think about it in terms of just continuously resampling your audience for what's important to them at a moment in time. Now, the challenge and why you use some of these advanced technologies is because the size of the data set that you're actually working with, the attribute set that you're actually working with, is just massive, right? I mean, so if you've got a context set of, say, even 100,000, which is relatively small, but you're engaging with them through multiple channels, you could be generating, 100,000, 200,000 new signal points every day, easily, right? Whether they're visiting a website or responding to an email, or, kind of very basic primitive things like that, not even engaged in a campaign, versus when you get up into someone who has a larger audience, where maybe they have 5, 10 million, 20 million different types of contacts. The size of that audience gets unmanageable, very quickly, at least at a human scale, right? It gets manageable when you can layer in the technologies that you're describing, so that you can identify some of these patterns and these correlations, in order to message them differently. So how it works inside the put it forward space is certainly first connecting to all those things, right? That's the first order bit problem, right? And then being able to continuously resample across those places where you're connecting to and adding more data to them, and so on and so forth. And then layering in the machine learning aspect of that, so you can start identifying what those correlations are across those different audiences, and then being able to drive that out into the targeted application or solution that you may be looking for. Now, some of that may be inside Put It Forward, some of that may be inside of another third-party application like a CDP or a data warehouse or an analytics application, or maybe even an ad tech serving platform. You can stitch all these things together depending on how you're using it and what your outcome is.
Let's talk about the results from all of this. You mentioned something very important there, which we have here. You mentioned depth. So the two big results that are obviously very clear from this is segmentation and clustering can be done at a much deeper level when all of this stuff is taken into account, to give a much more accurate view of your audience. But more importantly, you get to monitor exactly how that audience is changing over time, with time and motion dimension. Where would you believe is the most important area to stress today?
I think, well, the part to stress today especially is that you likely, or for an enterprise, likely has a lot of the raw elements that they need in order to do this well. I mean, it's a foreign concept, I think, to anyone who's really outside of data science, about the notion of what clustering is, right? And it can be, democratized as much as it can be, into other parts of the organization, just to start thinking about how your audience is changing based on how they're engaging, right? And that's really the kind of the key piece of this. And just as much as your audience is in motion in terms of how they're engaging with you, so too are you, right? Your perspective on what's important and relative and viable and a priority, changes in time as your audience is changing based on, what's relevant to the organization and going on in the greater world around us at a moment in time as well.
So the big takeaways in summary, what I see, and the piece that's often missing by big enterprises, is understanding how audience segments relate to each other, picking up that kind of commonality to, again, go back to the very beginning, to identify these nano segments that you can market to, Second big issue is leverage data science to better identify clusters to support marketing efforts. You talked about all of the data points that get tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands in any given day. And all of this is critical to support, once again, personalization at scale. Any other key summary points you'd like to mention here, or how these three weave together?
Yeah. Just as you were speaking, I was thinking about a conversation I was having just in the last couple of months with, the head of marketing at a large financial institution, and it doesn't matter which one because I think it applies to a number of them. And it kind of went like this, which is they have two states for their customers, which was interesting. They said they're before a customer and after a customer. And so before their customer, they could market to them in a very specific way. And then after, when they became a customer, and this has to do with regulatory reasons, right? After they became a customer, they had to market to them in a very different way, right? In terms of what they could say and promises they could make and claims they could, stake and so on and so forth. And, upon drilling into that, we looked really, and it became very clear quickly, is that once they became a customer, there were multiple different states, right? And so my first question to him was, so if somebody becomes a customer and they don't use your platform, they're still a customer. And the answer was yes. And so they had to have the same kind of oversight and overhead, and all this, work had to go into people who didn't use the platform as people that may use it 10 times a day. And so the point is that you have to go a lot deeper, based on the attributes that you're grabbing at a moment in time to create those correlations, to understand, who they are and how to personalize them, so that you can reach out and have a deep, meaningful, experience with an individual at a moment in time, not just, at a transactional point in time.
You just triggered a thought there in that little anecdotal story, and reaching out to customers. To what extent is all of this impacted by listening to the voice of the customer?
Voice of the customers is certainly an input into it. Absolutely. And often it's another layer that's, kind of thought about after the fact, and just, thought about around sort of customer health. But smart organizations that we see using that are really using, seeding some of that data in there to help, understand sentiment and understand propensity of that individual, and therefore creating a more richer view of that segment or that cluster that they're working with at that moment in time.
So what I've seen happen, and this might be a little bit controversial, but a lot of big enterprises, they survey customers to death. But do they really take all of that information back and weave it into building segments, clusters, marketing campaigns?
For the most part, no, as far as I've seen. But that doesn't mean have an omnipresent view of everything that's going on out there. I think some organizations are certainly using it are better than others. And you can think of some of the digital first organizations that use that feedback loop very effectively. But some of the more traditional enterprises, they've just got the internal firewalls that are blocking the sharing of that information for whatever reason. And those are the ones that certainly can benefit from using it the most.
Well, that's a wrap for chapter 8. Mark, excellent session as always. Thank you so much for your time.
That was a fun one.
Look forward to the next one.
All right. My pleasure, Jim. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.